Wait, we can have music going on too. That's fine. You don't want that. But we will be talking about building your own development process with PostCSS. I'm kind of excited to talk about this just because if you run into me at a meetup or something and we end up talking, we will end up talking about PostCSS. I kind of guarantee it. But my name is Cory Tanner, like he said, and just a little bit about myself. I got a degree in web application, 4-year degree, and then did some freelance stuff. Ended up as a director of digital communications, and then ended up at Dockyard about a little over a year ago. When I went to Dockyard, I went there to be a UX developer, which is somebody who works on HTML and CSS only, and then also kind of bridges the gap between the design team and the engineering team. An important thing about that, though, is that about 7 months ago, I would say, give or take, we started talking about PostCSS at Dockyard and wanted to see if it was something that we'd be able to use on our personal website and eventually in the client work. So in that time, I kind of took the lead on learning what PostCSS was, how to use it, and I kind of caught the PostCSS hype bug, I guess is the way to explain it. But before we dive into PostCSS, I want to make sure it's clear what a development process is in terms of CSS development. It's not really, like if you Google CSS development process, nothing really comes up at all. So this is my own definition of it. A development process is a combination of tools and guidelines that provide a direction for achieving a higher standard of work. And it's important to really, well, it's important. Why is it important? I'm going to explain why it's important. So it provides development tools and guidelines to develop maintainable CSS, which lets you just, it gives you an environment to work in where you will create CSS that'll be readable down the line for you and other developers. If you work in a team, your entire team is using the same tools, and your entire team is also writing CSS in the same way, which is important because when you want to do code reviews and things like that, which we'll get into, but it's easy to have the same kind of style of writing of your CSS as the end product. So let's dive into what PostCSS is. The definition is a CSS processor, which is important to note, that can extend or report on CSS at a number of different points within your workflow. So when you think about CSS processors, you kind of look at them as a preprocessor or a post-processor. Then I kind of have like a middle ground where linters kind of come in, which reports on your CSS. So a preprocessor will change CSS based off of syntax rules that you have stated. So something like a variable. A preprocessor will change that variable into what the variable is. And then you have the middle part, which is the reporting. So say you get extra space, spelled something wrong, doubled up on a style. A linter will tell you that there's something wrong and you should fix it. And then there's the post processors where it'll extend off of CSS that's written already. So something like auto prefixer where it adds prefixes on top of CSS that's already there. And the important thing about that, though, is that PostCSS does all those things. And it really lets you not have to worry about not having a tool available that you can use. So PostCSS, kind of from a bird's eye view, it has a huge community that's very responsive. Last month, I believe it had over 2 million downloads on NPM alone. And when I've reached out to people, even people who made PostCSS or somebody who made a plugin, it's been a very responsive, quick responses to questions and bug fixes, which I think is important to have a development tool in your development process that has a community backing it. So WordPress is famous for having an amazing community. It's the same thing with PostCSS. You'll get fast responses, and you can find great documentation, as well as the transitional period. So say you're using something like SASS, SCSS, or less. If you want to move to PostCSS, once you learn how to implement it, Learning how to write in kind of post-CSS terms, it's easy to transition into it. There are packages out there that let you write in like pre-CSS, let you write in Sass-like markup now. So it's a combination of plugins that let you kind of mimic the Sass environment. So say you want to keep writing with Sass markup, you can in post-CSS. And I really want to drive home the point that PostCSS is a CSS processor. It modifies, reports, and extends CSS at multiple points within your workflow. Just because of the name of PostCSS, where it has post in it, people think it's a post processor. It's not. It does everything. So we're going to talk about food. I kind of had the light bulb moment of really understanding what PostCSS was when I compared it to a sandwich. And it was kind of the way that I like to explain it to other people when I'm talking to them, / talking off their ear at meetups about PostCSS. So when you think of a sandwich, you have 3 parts to it. You have the top piece of bread, the middle part, which are all the ingredients, and then the bottom slice of bread. So in PostCSS, the top part is the parser, which is the top piece of bread, and the bottom part is a stringifier. Bread is always there. You'll always have 2 slices of bread, unless it's an open-faced sandwich, which is a fake sandwich. But it is. So the plugins, the ingredients of the sandwich are the things that can change. So if you want a ham sandwich, you just put ham on it. If you want a turkey sandwich, you do turkey, so on and so on and so on. The point is you can add whatever you want on your sandwich. So you can make a turkey peanut butter banana sandwich. It doesn't matter. It's the same with the plugins. You can interchange plugins, and they don't interfere with each other. So that's why I really do think PostCSS is here for the long haul, which is important when you're thinking about a development process, because you want tools in the process that aren't going to fade away after maybe like a year and a half or a year or two. You want something there that'll last and that you can keep building off of. So let's dive into what a plugin is. A plugin, it modifies your CSS based on rules within the plugin. So it's important to remember that a plugin is a single thing. It's a modular element within PostCSS. Don't expect one plugin to solve all your issues. You're going to be using multiple plugins. And if you run into the case where you can't find a solution for some kind of development issue, you can create your own plugins. They're written in JavaScript as node modules, and when you look at the slides afterwards, because they're awesome, anything that hovers in green has a link to it, and PostCSS Deep Dive by Tuts Plus has a great documentation on how to create plugins. So not only with great documentation, PostCSS itself gives you a boilerplate to create plugins. So it'll give you everything you need to know, good documentation, how to get started, all that good stuff. And there's new plugins coming out all the time, because plugins aren't made by just PostCSS alone as the guy who made it. Plugins are made by the community. People are making plugins. So what PostCSS does on Twitter is whenever a new plugin comes out, they usually tweet about it. New package comes out, they tweet about it. New technologies, everything like that. Another great website is postcss.parts. They have a very nicely laid out website of all the kind of starter plugins that you would want to use. So I definitely recommend checking those out. And that kind of leads into PostCSS packs. So we have plugins which are modular. They're one thing. Packs are a collection of plugins, and they're pre-packaged. And if you think of sandwiches again, if you go to the grocery store and you get a turkey sandwich that's wrapped up, it is pre-packaged. You can't change what's in it. You got that sandwich, you go to the checkout, you're done. Same thing as packs. They are a packaged CSS Next. It uses plugins to write tomorrow's syntax now, so you can do new things with CSS standards, write it how you would, and this combination of plugins will then take that CSS and change it into something that is supported on today's browsers. And then you have something like Narwhal Pack, which is a small hand-picked plugins that we chose at Dockyard to use in our development process. And this is really where things get interesting. And by the way, Narwin has nothing to do with PostCSS. It is just the adorable logo of Dockyard. But when you choose plugins, you want to choose plugins that benefit how you write CSS and how you structure your CSS. So we have 6 plugins in Narwin Pack. And I just want to go through each one of them real fast, tell you why we chose them, and all the details of that. So PostCSS partial import. Partial import lets you set up modular CSS files and import them all into one file. So this is really important because if we get designs from our design team, usually we'll take like a day or two to look over them, see what we need, see how we can break the design down, and set it up in a modular environment and what parts we need. So this will let us set up individual CSS files that only have styles in them for certain parts of your website. And then you can combine them back into one CSS file that will be included in your HTML, so you only have one HTTP request. If you wanted to use multiple CSS files to set up your CSS before this plugin, you'd have to reference all the CSS files. They're all into one. So an example of a modular CSS file structure, you have something like your styles folder. And then in the root of that folder, you have base, load, layout, and type.css, for example. So base would have things like, just have like your CSS reset. And then load would have variables in it. Layout would have layout styles that are only applied globally throughout your website or your app. And then type would have like headings, body text, things like that. So the important things about this are these are styles that affect the entire application. Then we have a modulars folder, which hold things like header, footer, navigation. These are all the modular elements of the page that can be used at multiple points within the website. And then, like I said, it's important. So you have your base, load, type, modular folders. They all get put into styles.css. It gets put out to the application. Then you have PostCSS custom properties, which is variables in your CSS, which is awesome. And it's also important to remember that you need to have naming conventions for your variables. So this kind of goes into the part where you have your project, you set up your file structure for how you want your CSS to be, or at least part of it. Then you want to think about what colors you're going to be using in the application, what font sizes you're going to have, what font families you're going to have. Just everything like that. And you want to think about how you're going to name them and how you're going to include them as variables. So, sorry, I forgot to mention, if you use root, variables are then globally accessible by all your CSS files. So we have a organized variable example where we have colors and font weights. So we have white, green, and then we have a green with a 75 opacity. We write 75 green because that's what it does. And then we have font weights where you have light and bold. But you want to think about how you name things, just because with font weights you have light, bold, bold, regular, and black. So if you have a color named black, it's just not going to work. So you want to think about how you're going to name things, because you may know that you're talking about the font weight for black, but another developer that jumps on the project, or even yourself, like a month from then, might forget that you made black a font weight. So when you put black in as a color on a variable for color, you're going to get a font weight in your output file. And just an example of how a variable would work in CSS, you have your variable green. Anywhere in any of your other CSS files, you call upon that variable for, say, color, and it just outputs the RGBA. It's real straightforward and simple. Then you have something like auto prefixer, which is arguably the most popular plugin for PostCSS, and a lot of people don't know that it is a PostCSS plugin. It's made by the same people who made PostCSS, but this is something that makes the life of the developer easier. It's not really structural, but it's based off of the website Can I Use and its database prefixes. And what this will do, it'll add prefixes on top of styles that need it. So this is kind of like the post-processing part. So you can also configure browser support. So if you only want to go back, if you only want to support 2 versions of a browser back, you can do that as well. So you don't want to do IE8, you don't have to. So an example of this is display flex. So if, for you as a developer, when you write your CSS, you only have to write display flex. You don't have to think about what prefixes do I need to remember to include so it'll be supported on browsers across the board. What auto prefixer will do, it'll add it for you automatically. Then you have PostCSS nested, which I kind of think we have the most rules for, which I'll get into. But it unwraps nested styles, just like, for example, how SASS would. But within our development process, we found that it is important to kind of have limitations on what you can nest. We only use it for pseudo elements and classes, along with media queries. We'll also include styles that are dependent on parent classes as well. But an example of this is if you want to have searchable CSS. So we have an element called block element. So not element, a class called block element. If you nest that class name within another class, you can't search for block element. You're going to have to kind of dig through your CSS to find it. Where if you just write out your class names and you don't nest class names, you can then search your entire CSS file structure for that name. Also, I kind of think it's easier to read this way, but that's more personal preference than anything. So an example of good nesting is we have navlink. So the color is white, it gets that, and then if it has a class next to it called isActive, or you hover over it, you get another color, then you have a media query. But the main thing about this is that all of these nested items pertain to navlink only. It's the things in there only affect navlink and nothing else. So it doesn't affect another class, within your environment. And then one of the more simple ones, and we really only have PostCSS calc because we have variables, but it reduces calc references when possible and includes variables in calculations. So a quick example of this is font size. If you want to double it, I know you really would never do this, but it really shows, shows what it can do. You can include the variable within the calculation, and then the output will just be 36 pixels. So it's pretty straightforward, but it allows you to use variables within. So if you want to do like width calculations or things like that, you can do that. This next one, I'm not really going to explain it too much, just because SVG fragments could be a talk kind of all within itself. But kind of the overview of it is that it uses SVG fragments in CSS, obviously. But what that means is that you can have multiple SVG files, put them all into one SVG file, attach IDs to them, and then within your HTML, you can then call upon that ID and it'll grab that SVG. So what this plugin does, it then translates that into CSS. So you can include it in a background image and you call upon that one file, so defs.svg. You reference to the ID, which would be pattern per se, and then the output, it'll put SVG data in of what that pattern was. It'll also apply fills and strokes, which is really nice. But the important thing about this is that we had a specific method of how we were writing not writing SVGs, but using SVGs in our application. And there was an app that met that specific way we were doing it. So PostCSS can adapt to any way that you're developing your CSS. Just because it's written in JavaScript, which means it edits CSS how you want it to edit it. So it's why I kind of think it's here for the long haul, and you can really use it for any situation that you run into. So you have all these plugins and how you write CSS, but you need guidelines and standards for how you write them. And how to set up this, making guidelines easy to access and change is really important. So including GitHub, Google Docs, use Canvas, the thing these all have in common is that you can collaborate with other people on them and easily access them to make changes to them. A great example of this is at Docker. We have our style guides repo, and we have everything in there from beginning of project to HTML to CSS. But all these include how we as a team want to write our CSS and HTML. And some examples of some guidelines would be, well, more examples, would be like implementing ideas from SMACSS or BEM. SMACSS is scalable and modular architecture for CSS, BEM, block element modifier. But the main point about this is that we pick and choose what we want to use from them. So with BEM, we use the naming conventions. From SMACSS, we use its architecture. The main point is to use techniques that you want to use as a team and that fit your team. And that will produce dry CSS. So CSS is not overlapping or anything like that. Then also use high-performing animation, so always have performance in mind. You can write something really, really cool, but if it's laggy for the user on the other end of it, it really doesn't matter. And CSS order declarations, this is more of writing things in a certain way so other developers on your team can understand it more quickly. So we order it by importance. So we have positioning, then the box model, typography, visual, and so on. The more important thing to note is that positioning can affect the box model. So if you float something in your box model, you have position absolute, you're not floating anywhere. Other people organize it by alphabetical. It just depends on how you want to do it as a team. And then a great quote from Adam Morris is, try to construct systems that allows people of all abilities to spend more time designing, building, and less time debugging, fighting, and crying. So the main point with your guidelines is just to provide structure and an environment where people can easily write great code. And you need to ask yourself, how does the code you're writing affect the production code? So you can have tools that make your life easy, but if the code that is outputted by PostCSS isn't performant, it doesn't provide a good user experience, or it overwrites a whole bunch of styles and creates spaghetti code, it doesn't matter at all. You need to write CSS that provides a good user experience. And the little things do add up to make a big difference in the quality of your CSS and the performance of your website. So don't think that you can just kind of skip over one thing because, oh, it's just like one line of code. They add up and they build up on top of each other. A great way to avoid that type of stuff is through code reviews. And setting up code reviews is very important. So just review everything. There really are like few downsides to code review, and the only downside I can think is time, but really you're spending time to make the quality of your code better. It keeps code clean. And so if you're working in a team and you have this code that you just made and you want to let your team review it, but you're kind of nervous about it because you're not sure how good the code is, don't be nervous. People aren't going to judge you. They're there to help you and make your code better. And it goes vice versa. You'll learn from each other. If you're not in a team and you're just working on your own, step away for like an hour or a day, and then come back to your CSS with fresh eyes. I guarantee you, you will notice things that you didn't notice an hour ago. And just kind of some takeaways from the talk is development tools and CSS guidelines give you structure to develop great CSS. Without it, it's easy to stray away. If you just give yourself kind of a path to go down, I guarantee you your CSS will be cleaner, will be drier, you'll finish projects faster, and teams will benefit from this, I would think, even more, just because everybody's writing CSS the same way, they're structuring their CSS the same way, they're going through the same steps. Here are some useful links for you if you would like for some reading, and my slides are available online at ctannerweb.github.io talks/postcssdev. And DocNerd is hiring, so come talk to me. I have awesome stickers. And you can also visit our website at docnerd.com. And thanks.